It was the summer of 2014 when I decided to take a break from everything and spend a week in a rented cabin deep in the countryside of southern Kentucky. I had been working long hours as a mechanic in Louisville, and I felt drained, mentally, physically, everything. I wanted quiet, just quiet, somewhere far from the constant noise of traffic and machines. The idea of being surrounded by fields and trees, with no one around for miles, sounded perfect at the time. The cabin sat at the end of a long gravel road that broke off from a narrow 2-lane highway. The drive took nearly 6 hours, and by the time I reached the turnoff, the sun had already started to dip behind the low hills. The road was rough and unmaintained, filled with ruts and loose stones. Dust kicked up behind my truck, hanging in the air like smoke. I passed no other cars, no houses, not even a sign of people. Just miles of open land, dry grass, and the occasional fence post tilting out of the dirt. The cabin wasn't much to look at. A single-story structure with a small porch, weathered with siding, and a rusty tin roof. It sat at the edge of a dense patch of trees that seemed to stretch endlessly behind it. The nearest farmhouse was maybe 2 or 3 miles away. The rental owner had left the key under a flat rock near the steps, just like he said in the message. Inside, it was simple, bare floors, a small kitchen, a single bedroom, and a back room with some old tools and boxes stacked against the wall. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, and barely any phone service. That was fine by me. I unpacked a few things, set up my old sleeping bag on the bed, and took a walk outside before it got dark. The air was dry and still. Not even a breeze moved the tall grass. I remember standing there, looking at the open field in front of the cabin, and feeling a strange kind of silence that I wasn't used to. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. That night, I cooked some canned soup on the small propane stove and sat outside on the porch steps to eat. The sky was clear, filled with stars, brighter than I had ever seen. The only sound was the faint buzz of insects and the creaking of wood as the cabin settled. It felt lonely but calm, and I told myself that's what I had come here for. But sometime after midnight, I woke up to a noise. It was faint, but enough to pull me from sleep. A slow, dragging sound coming from outside, like something heavy sliding across the dirt. I stayed still, listening. The noise would start, then stop, then start again, moving somewhere behind the cabin. I tried to tell myself it was probably an animal, a deer, or maybe a raccoon digging through something. Still, I found myself getting up, grabbing the small flashlight from my bag, and walking to the window. The beam barely reached the edge of the woods, but I caught a glimpse of something. A shape, maybe. Something low to the ground, but it moved with a weird rhythm. I couldn't make out details before it disappeared into the dark. I stood there for a while, listening, but the noise didn't come back. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I walked around the back of the cabin. The dirt there was uneven, full of old leaves and dry grass, but I noticed something that made me stop. There was a long drag mark leading from the edge of the trees toward the back wall of the cabin, then turning off toward the shed about 30 feet away. It wasn't deep, but it looked fresh, like something had been pulled or dragged. I followed it until it faded into the grass near the shed. The shed door was half open, its hinges rusted. I peeked inside but saw nothing unusual, just some old boards, an empty fuel can, and a broken wheelbarrow. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe it was a fallen branch that got dragged by the wind, or an animal pulling something. The place was old and unkempt. Things like that happen. By the third night, the silence of the countryside started feeling different. During the day, the air was hot, the sun baking the dirt road until it shimmered. But as soon as darkness fell, everything felt sharper. Every sound, every creak of the wood floor, even my own breathing. The dragging sound came back that night, closer this time. I heard it around 1 in the morning, moving slowly around the cabin side. I didn't look out the window this time. I just sat in bed, my dog, a brown mixed breed named Toby, growling low from his spot near the door. His ears were raised, his eyes fixed toward the window. The sound stopped after a minute or two, and Toby kept staring for a long time before finally lying back down. The next morning, I found a small dent in the lower part of the cabin's outer wall, right where the dragging sound had been. It looked like something had hit or scraped it. I crouched down and noticed faint marks in the dirt again. Long, uneven lines. Whatever it was, it had been moving around the cabin, maybe circling it. I started feeling uneasy being there, but I had already paid for the week, and I didn't want to admit that I was spooked by some noise in the dark. I spent that day trying to distract myself. I went for a walk down the gravel road, found a small creek about half a mile away, and skipped stones across it. The countryside had a strange beauty to it. Quiet, endless, untouched. But the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When I got back, the air had changed. It was cloudy, and the wind had picked up. The tall grass around the cabin was swaying hard, making that dry, rustling sound that feels almost alive. I tried to read for a while inside, but the wind made the walls groan, and it was hard to focus. That night was the worst. The dragging started again just after midnight, but it wasn't alone this time. I heard a sharp, metallic sound, like something scraping against the shed. Toby went crazy, barking and growling, running back and forth between the door and the window. I grabbed my flashlight and waited, listening. The dragging got louder, closer, until I could hear it right outside the wall next to where I was sitting. The sound was so clear it felt like it was just inches away. Then suddenly, everything stopped. Silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. I didn't sleep that night. When morning came, I finally stepped outside. The ground was covered in marks, dozens of them, long drag lines, footprints, scuffs, even a few small holes near the shed. I followed the lines and found something half buried in the dirt about 20 yards away. A piece of torn tarp, the kind used for covering old equipment. It was shredded and covered in mud. Beneath it was a rusted chain and what looked like an old shovel. I started realizing what had probably been happening. The property was probably used for something before the cabin was rented out. Maybe old farming equipment or construction junk was buried back there, and over the years the ground shifted, pulling up old debris when the weather changed. The dragging sounds, the dents, the marks. It could have all been from the wind tugging at buried metal and loose chains against the dirt. The more I looked, the more sense it made. But even after understanding it, the feeling of unease never went away. I stayed one last night because I wanted to prove to myself that I could. That final night was silent again. No dragging, no strange noises. Just the steady hum of crickets and the distant sound of wind moving through the trees. In the morning, I packed my things, loaded the truck, and looked at the cabin one last time. It stood there, quiet and still, surrounded by open land. The marks were already fading under the sun. It almost felt like nothing had ever happened. On the drive back, I couldn't stop thinking about that sound, though. The dragging, the weight behind it. Even if I had explained it to myself, some part of me didn't buy it completely. It wasn't the sound of wind or shifting ground. It was slow, deliberate, like something being pulled by hand. I never went back to that place again. When I tried to look up the cabin online months later, the listing was gone. Maybe it was sold, or maybe the owner stopped renting it out. I didn't care enough to find out. All I know is that sometimes, when I lie awake at night and the house is completely quiet, I still hear that faint dragging sound in the back of my mind. Slow, heavy, steady. And every time I do, I remind myself of that empty field in Kentucky and how quiet the world can really be when there's no one left to hear it. It was October of 2014 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin deep in northern Arizona. I had been working long hours in construction back in Phoenix, and I needed some quiet. The cabin belonged to a guy I knew from work. His uncle used to stay there during hunting season, but he hadn't been up there for years. It sat at the edge of a dry forest area, surrounded by tall juniper trees, scattered rocks, and silence so thick it made you notice your own breathing. The drive there took nearly 6 hours. The last 40 minutes were on a dirt road so rough it shook my truck like it was about to fall apart. There were no signs, no cell service, just an endless stretch of dusty tracks winding through brush and dead trees. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was low and orange, the kind of light that makes everything look still and heavy. The cabin itself looked worn down but solid. Weathered wood, tin roof, one window facing the west, and a narrow porch with a rusted chair. Inside, it smelled like dust and old pine. The floorboards creaked, and when I opened the small kitchen cabinets, I found old cans of beans, half-used matches, and a coffee tin full of nails. There was no electricity, only a small fireplace and a lantern I brought. I unloaded my supplies, some canned food, bottled water, my sleeping bag, and a small cooler, and set everything neatly against the wall. That first night was quiet, too quiet. Out there, silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. The only sound was wind sliding through the cracks in the wood. When the wind stopped, everything stopped. No crickets, no owls, no movement. Just still air and the faint sound of my heartbeat. The next morning, I went for a walk behind the cabin, where the land dipped into a shallow gully. I saw deer tracks in the dirt and some kind of animal bones scattered near a rock. The bones were dry and cracked, maybe from months ago. I remember thinking a coyote might have dragged them there. I stayed out for an hour before heading back, mostly to collect small branches for the fireplace. Later that evening, while sitting outside watching the sunset, I noticed something strange. The forest seemed to go silent again, just like the night before, but this time it felt different. I could hear faint footsteps somewhere behind the cabin. Not close, but not far either. They were slow, dragging, uneven. I stood still, listening. After a minute, the sound stopped. I went inside, shut the door, and tried to shake it off. Probably an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer, maybe a stray dog. But I couldn't get the sound out of my head. It wasn't the light, quick sound of hooves. It sounded heavier. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time closer. Slow steps moving from one side of the cabin to the other. The dry leaves outside crunched under the weight. I held my breath, listening. It stopped for a few seconds, then started again, circling the cabin. The sound of wood creaked as something brushed against the porch. I wanted to look through the window, but I was scared to move. The cabin felt smaller with each sound. My hands were shaking. I sat there in the dark, my back against the wall, holding the small axe I kept for splitting wood. After maybe 20 minutes, the sound faded. Nothing else happened for the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked outside. The dirt around the porch was disturbed, but I couldn't make out any clear prints. The ground was dry and hard. I walked around the cabin slowly, scanning the ground, the trees, the brush, nothing. It was quiet again. I told myself it could have been a coyote or maybe even a wandering cow. Out here, that wasn't impossible. The third day, I decided to stay close to the cabin. I kept myself busy cutting wood and cleaning out the small shed out back. Around evening, I heard what sounded like someone calling faintly in the distance. It was hard to tell where it was coming from, maybe half a mile away, maybe less. It wasn't a clear shout, more like a long, broken sound, like someone trying to call for help but not really forming words. I froze. The sound came again, softer this time, and then silence. I waited for several minutes, staring at the direction it came from. Nothing moved. Eventually, I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to convince myself it was an animal. Out there, strange sounds traveled far. Maybe it was just wind pushing through the rocks, but it didn't sound like wind. That night, the footsteps came back. They started around 1 in the morning. Slow, careful steps in the dirt, circling the cabin. Sometimes stopping, sometimes continuing. Then I heard something heavier hit the porch, like a footstep. The boards creaked. I sat in complete darkness, holding my axe again, my breathing quiet and shallow. The smell hit me next, something foul and sour, like rotten meat mixed with wet earth. It seeped through the cracks around the window and door. I could feel my stomach twist. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The footsteps eventually faded. I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, I went outside carefully, scanning every inch around the cabin. That smell still lingered faintly in the air. I noticed something strange near the edge of the tree line, what looked like torn fabric caught on a low branch. I walked over and found a piece of cloth, dark and stiff with dirt. It looked like part of an old jacket sleeve, maybe even burned around the edges. Something about it didn't sit right. I turned it over in my hand, felt the roughness of it, and saw what looked like dried blood on one side. I dropped it and went back to the cabin. I packed my bag. But before I left, I decided to take one last look around the area, thinking maybe it was just some old trash left by campers. I followed a faint trail leading down the slope behind the cabin. About 50 yards down, I found something that made my stomach drop. There were animal bones, fresh ones this time. Some still had flesh on them. They were scattered in a small circle, mixed with bits of fabric, shoe pieces, and something that looked like part of a belt buckle. I turned around immediately and started heading back up the trail. Halfway up, I heard a sound behind me. Something like breathing, heavy and uneven. I didn't turn around. I just kept walking faster, trying not to break into a full run. The breathing got louder for a few seconds, then stopped completely. When I reached the cabin, I grabbed everything I could fit into my truck and left without looking back. The dirt road was rough and I drove faster than I should have. Every bump made my hands grip the steering wheel tighter. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway 2 hours later. That night, I stayed at a cheap motel in Flagstaff. I remember sitting in the shower for nearly an hour, just letting the hot water run over me. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept thinking about that smell, those footsteps, the circle of bones. A few weeks later, I called the guy who owned the cabin to tell him what happened. He didn't say much, just told me that his uncle used to hear things out there too. That's why he stopped going years ago. He mentioned that the locals sometimes talked about something in those woods that could mimic people and animals. He laughed a little after saying it, but it wasn't the kind of laugh you do when you find something funny. It was the kind you do when you don't want to believe what you're saying. I haven't been back to that part of Arizona since. Sometimes, when I drive through remote areas, I still remember those slow footsteps circling the cabin. The sound of dry leaves crunching under something heavy. The smell that didn't belong to anything alive. And even now, whenever I go camping or stay somewhere far from people, I find myself staying awake longer than I should, listening to the dark, waiting for a sound I hope I never hear again. It had been raining for 3 straight days when I decided to finally start building the cabin. The land I had bought sat deep in the woods of northern Washington, about 15 miles from the nearest paved road. I had planned for this trip for months. Time away from people, noise, and everything that made life feel heavy. I was 32 and tired of the city, tired of concrete, and the hum of streetlights that never went off. I wanted silence. I wanted to build something with my own hands, even if it was small and rough. The rain didn't stop though. It came in waves, sometimes light, sometimes heavy enough to blur the trees into shadows. The ground was soft and cold, and every step I took left a wet print that filled up within seconds. My pickup was parked about 100 feet down the dirt path, loaded with tools, food, and sheets of plywood that were now slick and damp. By the time I started unloading, my jacket was soaked through. The smell of wet pine filled the air, mixed with that earthy rot smell that always comes from the forest after days of rain. I chose a small flat clearing between two tall cedars to build. The trees around it formed a kind of wall, and I liked how hidden it felt. I could barely hear the sound of the road, only the steady tapping of rain on leaves and the occasional creak of a tree bending in the wind. It wasn't supposed to be anything fancy, just a small one-room cabin with a tin roof, a cot, and a stove. I had marked out the area before the rain started, but now the lines were washed away. My boots sank into the mud as I measured again, trying to keep the posts straight. Every nail I drove in felt heavier, slower. The hammer kept slipping in my wet hands. My gloves were too damp to be useful. As the day went on, the rain started to get colder. The light faded early, even though it wasn't that late. The sky was thick with dark clouds, and the air had that gray weight that comes before another downpour. My back ached from bending over the frame, and my stomach had been growling for hours. I stopped to eat some jerky from the truck and stood there, breathing the wet air, staring at the half-built structure. The cabin skeleton was up, just the frame and a few boards along the lower half of one wall. It didn't look like much, but in that quiet clearing, it already felt like something. The ground around it was covered in footprints and scraps of wood, all turning soft in the rain. My hands were covered in mud and sawdust, and every part of me felt heavier. When the rain picked up again, I decided to cover what I could with a tarp and take shelter in the truck. The path back was slippery, and a few times I almost lost my footing. The forest was darker now. The rain made everything look the same, just layers of black and gray. When I reached the truck, I turned on the headlights. The beams cut through the rain, lighting up the clearing just enough to see the outline of the cabin. The tarp was flapping in the wind. It didn't look steady, but I didn't care. I climbed into the truck, closed the door, and listened to the rain hammer against the roof. I sat there for a long time. My phone had no signal and the battery was almost dead. The only sound was the rain and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere outside. I tried to rest my eyes, but my mind wouldn't quiet down. The woods were loud in a strange way, like the rain carried other sounds with it. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something heavier than rain hitting the ground, something moving. Probably a deer, I told myself, maybe an elk wandering nearby. Around midnight, the rain turned to a steady drizzle. I decided to check on the cabin again. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cold air. The forest felt different at night, still but alive. The rain dripping off leaves sounded sharper. The beam of the flashlight moved across the trees, catching small reflections, wet bark, puddles, and sometimes the quick flash of animal eyes before they disappeared into the dark. When I reached the cabin, I noticed something strange. One of the boards I had nailed earlier was lying on the ground, half buried in the mud. I stood there for a moment, thinking maybe the wind had knocked it loose, but the nail holes didn't match the way it fell. It looked pulled off, not blown down. I checked the other boards. Two of them had small splinters along the edges, like someone or something had pried at them. I felt uneasy. My stomach tightened, and I kept glancing around the trees. The light from the flashlight moved across the clearing, but everything looked the same, just wet branches and dark shapes. Still, I couldn't shake that crawling feeling at the back of my neck, like I wasn't alone. I picked up the board, leaned it against the frame, and decided to pack up the tools for the night. As I turned to grab my hammer, I froze. There were fresh prints in the mud near the cabin, boot prints, not animal tracks. They weren't mine. They were larger and deeper, and they led from the edge of the clearing toward the back of the cabin. My mouth went dry. I didn't move for a long minute. The prints looked recent. Rainwater hadn't filled them in yet. My first thought was maybe a hunter had passed through, or maybe someone had seen the truck from the logging road earlier and came to check it out. But this was private land. No one should have been there. I slowly backed away toward the truck, keeping the flashlight pointed ahead. My boots made soft squelching sounds in the mud, and each one felt louder than it should have. When I finally reached the truck, I locked the doors and sat there, breathing hard. The woods outside were quiet again, but it didn't feel like before. It was a different kind of quiet, heavier, like it was waiting. I stayed in the truck until morning. I didn't sleep. I kept the flashlight in my lap, watching the darkness outside. Every noise made me flinch. I could see faint movements sometimes, branches swaying, rain dripping, but nothing clear. Around dawn, the rain stopped completely. The forest was still wet and gray, but now I could see better. I stepped out and went to check the clearing again. The boot prints were still there, but now I could see where they led. They went behind the cabin, through the trees, and then stopped near a large cedar. I followed them slowly. There were marks on the bark, like someone had leaned against it, maybe watched from there. I looked around, but there was no one. Just the sound of water dripping from the leaves and the faint rustle of wind through the branches. I didn't stay long. I gathered my tools, loaded them back into the truck, and left. The road out was rough, the tires slipping in the mud, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be out of there. The woods that had once felt peaceful now felt wrong, like something had been too close for too long. A few days later, after the rain cleared, I went back to check. The clearing looked almost the same except for one thing. Someone had finished the wall I left half done. The same boards, same nails, but I hadn't done it. The boards were nailed unevenly, and the hammer marks were rough, like whoever did it wasn't careful. There were new footprints too, the same size as before, leading back into the trees. I stood there in the quiet for a long time, staring at that wall, and then I turned and left again. I never went back after that. Now, years later, I sometimes think about that night. The rain, the footprints, the sound of wood cracking in the dark. I never figured out who it was or why they were there. Maybe someone had been living out there before me. Maybe they didn't like me building on their land. Whatever the reason, that cabin still stands out there somewhere, deep in the woods, half mine and half someone else's work. And every time it rains hard enough to drown out the world, I can still smell that wet pine and feel that same uneasy silence pressing in from the trees, as if something out there is still waiting by that wall, watching the clearing, listening for the sound of nails being driven into wood again. It had been almost 3 years since the divorce, and I hadn't seen or spoken to my ex-wife, Allison, since the day we signed the papers. We'd been married for 7 years, and for most of it, we spent weekends up at the small cabin her father built decades ago in the northern part of Maine. After everything ended, I tried not to think about that place, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't cross my mind sometimes. That quiet wooden cabin tucked away between tall pines, beside a narrow dirt road that barely showed up on maps. In early October 2022, I was driving back from a delivery job that had taken me through northern Maine. It was late in the evening, cold, and the clouds were thick enough to smother the last bit of daylight. I hadn't planned to take the back roads, but my GPS rerouted me after a wreck closed part of the highway. As I followed that winding dirt road through miles of forest, I realized where I was. I knew those bends, those overgrown turnoffs, and the narrow wooden bridge over the creek. I was passing near the old cabin. For a few minutes, I debated whether to keep driving or stop. I told myself I just wanted to see if the place was still standing, maybe for some sense of closure or curiosity, I don't know. I pulled over at the small clearing where the drive used to split off from the main road. The air smelled like wet pine and cold soil. My headlights cut through the trees, showing only part of the path that led to the cabin, which was now half covered in weeds and small branches. I parked and got out. The ground was soft from recent rain, and each step made that quiet squelching sound as mud stuck to my boots. The deeper I walked into the woods, the darker it got. I didn't have a flashlight, only my phone light, which was weak and flickered occasionally. Still, I could see the shape of the cabin as I got closer, the same small, boxy frame with the slanted roof and the stone chimney. The front porch sagged a little more than I remembered, and one of the window shutters was hanging loose. The cabin looked abandoned. The air around it felt still, heavy, like the place had been holding its breath for years. The door was slightly open, and the faint smell of damp wood came from inside. I pushed it open with my hand, and the hinges creaked, loud in the silence. The inside was a mess. Dust covered everything. The old couch was still there, the same one we'd bought from a thrift store years ago. The small table beside it had a layer of grime so thick you could write your name in it. The kitchen counter still had a few cups stacked near the sink, and one of them was cracked in half. On the far wall, the old wood stove sat cold and rusty. I walked slowly through each room, my shoes leaving muddy prints on the floorboards. In the back bedroom, the bed frame had collapsed on one side, and the old mattress had turned yellow from moisture. A few of Allison's old books were still there, warped and stuck together. There was even an old flannel shirt hanging on a nail behind the door, hers, I think. I just stood there for a while, taking it all in, remembering the mornings we used to sit on the porch drinking coffee, or the way she'd stack logs in the fire pit behind the cabin while I split wood. It all felt far away, like it happened to someone else. As I walked back toward the front room, I noticed something strange. The door, which I'd left slightly open, was now shut. I figured maybe the wind had pushed it, but there was no draft, and the air outside was calm. I tried not to overthink it. I told myself it was nothing, but I felt uneasy all the same. I checked the time on my phone, 8:43 p.m., and realized I should probably head back before it got any darker. As I turned to leave, I heard a soft thump from somewhere behind the cabin. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough that I froze. It sounded like something falling onto wet ground. I waited a few seconds, listening. Nothing else followed. I stepped outside, my phone light cutting across the trees behind the cabin. The beam caught something, a shape low to the ground near the old woodpile. I moved closer, careful with each step. When I got near enough, I saw it was just an old tarp that had come loose and fallen from the shed. I felt stupid for being so jumpy, but that didn't stop the tight feeling in my chest. I decided to go back the way I came, through the narrow path to the road. But before leaving, I wanted one last look at the cabin. I stood a few feet away, staring at it in the faint light. Something about it looked different now. Not haunted, not eerie in any supernatural way, just heavy, like it held all the weight of the years that passed, everything that went wrong between us. When I turned to leave, I noticed tire tracks near where I had parked. They weren't mine. They looked fresh, the mud still wet and glistening. They came from the opposite direction, the way deeper into the forest, and stopped a few feet behind my truck. For a moment, I thought maybe someone else had come down the road earlier, but the pattern in the mud looked too sharp, too recent. I scanned the road with my light, but the trees swallowed it after a few yards. The forest was quiet. No crickets, no wind, just that thick, cold silence. I climbed into the truck and locked the doors without even thinking. As I sat there with the engine idling, I saw something faint in my rearview mirror. A light, maybe a flashlight or a phone, far down the path behind me. It flickered once, then went out. I stared at that spot for nearly a minute, trying to decide if I actually saw it or if my eyes were just playing tricks on me. Either way, I didn't want to find out. I threw the truck into reverse, turned onto the dirt road, and drove off fast enough that the mud kicked up against the sides. For the next 10 miles, I kept glancing at my mirrors. I didn't see any headlights behind me. The forest road eventually opened up into the main route, and when I reached a gas station an hour later, I pulled over to collect myself. When I got out to fill the tank, I noticed something stuck in the back of the truck bed. A strip of black plastic, about 6 inches long. It looked like part of a trash bag or maybe the tarp from behind the cabin. But what bothered me was that it was wedged tight between the bed and the tailgate, like someone had pushed it there. I hadn't been near the back of the truck since I parked at the cabin. I threw it away and got back on the road, driving through the night without stopping again. That was 2 years ago. I haven't been near that part of Maine since, and I've made sure not to take any routes that pass close to that cabin. A few months back, though, I was scrolling through a local news site and a headline caught my eye. It said "Unidentified vehicle found near abandoned property. Police investigating possible foul play." The photo was small and grainy, but I recognized the area. It was that same narrow dirt road. They said a car had been found parked just off the trail, doors unlocked, lights still on. No one ever came forward to claim it. I don't know if that has anything to do with the night I stopped by the cabin, but sometimes when I think about those fresh tire tracks and that faint light behind me, I wonder if whoever that was, whoever had been there, thought the same thing about me. Maybe they saw my truck parked near the trees and thought I was the one trespassing. Maybe they watched me walk into that cabin. Maybe they were the reason the door shut behind me. I'll never really know. But one thing I'm sure of is this: that place, that old cabin, it's better left alone. Some memories aren't worth digging up again, and some roads shouldn't be driven twice. It was late October of 2014 when I decided to spend a few days alone at an old cabin that sat near an abandoned graveyard in northern Michigan. I had been working as a freelance land surveyor for a small private company, and my boss asked me to check out some property boundaries deep in the woods that had been neglected for decades. The land was owned by a family who had moved away long ago, and the only structure left standing was a small wooden cabin from the 1940s. It sat about 50 yards from the edge of an overgrown graveyard that hadn't been maintained in years. When I first arrived, the air felt heavy and still. The dirt road that led to the cabin was narrow, barely wide enough for my truck. The trees on both sides leaned inward like they were trying to close off the path. My dog, Duke, sat quietly in the passenger seat, his head resting on the dashboard. He was a calm dog, not easily spooked, but even he seemed unusually alert that morning. The cabin looked worse than I expected. The wood had darkened with age, and most of the paint had peeled off. The porch steps were soft from rot, and one of the windows had been patched with plywood. The door still had an old padlock, but the key the company gave me worked. Inside, it smelled of mold and damp wood. Dust covered everything: the table, the bed frame, the shelves. I found an old oil lamp sitting on a table and a few rusted cans in the corner. I spent the first few hours cleaning up enough space to sleep. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the floor near the fireplace and set my small camping stove on the table. The air inside stayed cold, even with the fire burning. There was no power, no running water, just silence except for the occasional sound of the trees shifting outside. That first evening, I took a walk around the property to map out the boundaries. The graveyard wasn't large, maybe 20 or 30 headstones, but most of them had sunk into the earth or cracked in half. The grass had grown up past my knees, and a few thin birch trees had started to sprout among the graves. The dates on the stones went back to the 1800s. A few were too faded to read. Some of the ground had caved in slightly, forming shallow depressions. It was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like even the birds avoided the place. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was setting. The woods turned dark quickly, and the wind started to move through the trees in long, drawn-out breaths. I built another fire and sat near it with Duke lying close to my feet. The wood popped and cracked in the fireplace, and for a while that sound was the only thing keeping me from noticing the silence outside. Around midnight, I woke up to Duke growling softly. His body was stiff, and his head was turned toward the door. I didn't hear anything at first, but after a few seconds, I noticed a faint scraping sound outside. It was steady, slow, like something dragging through the dirt. I sat there trying to figure out what it was. It stopped after a few seconds, then started again, a bit closer. I got up and quietly walked to the window. The night was pitch black beyond the firelight. I couldn't see anything except the thin outline of trees moving slightly in the wind. I stayed up for another hour, listening. The sound came and went, always soft, always slow. Eventually, I convinced myself it was an animal. Maybe a raccoon or a deer rubbing against a tree. Still, I had a hard time falling back asleep after that. The next morning, I walked around the cabin and saw fresh marks in the dirt near the porch. They looked like something had been dragged. A long, uneven line, as if a heavy branch or a log had been pulled along. The line stopped a few feet from the steps and then turned back toward the woods. I followed it for a bit, but it disappeared into the leaves. I spent most of that day working in the woods, marking points on the map and measuring distances. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in, and it started to drizzle. I packed up my gear and returned to the cabin. Duke was restless again, pacing near the door. I fed him, then sat near the fire with a cup of instant coffee, listening to the rain tapping against the roof. When night came, I could hear the rain turning heavier. It beat against the windows, and water dripped steadily through a small gap in the ceiling near the back wall. I set a metal pot under it to catch the leaks. The fire kept dying out faster than usual, and every time I added more wood, the smoke seemed thicker. I opened the door slightly to let some air in, and that's when I noticed something unusual outside. The shape of a light, faint and steady, down near the graveyard. It wasn't bright like a flashlight. It was more like a dull orange glow, low to the ground, barely visible through the rain. I stood in the doorway for a while, trying to figure out what could be causing it. Maybe an old lantern left there years ago that somehow caught the reflection of lightning. Or maybe someone had camped nearby. I told myself it was nothing, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I shut the door, pushed a chair against it, and went back to sit near the fire. Duke refused to settle down. Every time the wind hit the side of the cabin, he'd lift his head and stare toward the door. I stayed awake until the fire went out completely. The cabin was freezing, and I could hear the rain slowing to a drizzle. The moment I started to drift off, there was a dull thump on the porch. Then another. Something stepped onto the old wood. I could hear the boards creaking under its weight, slow and deliberate. Duke stood up, his ears straight. The sound stopped for a few seconds, then came again, one step, then another. The weight wasn't light. It wasn't the quick tapping of an animal. It was heavy, careful. I sat completely still, breathing through my nose, trying not to make a sound. The steps moved from one side of the porch to the other, then down to the ground again. I didn't sleep after that. When morning finally came, the air felt colder than usual. The rain had stopped, but everything was soaked. I stepped outside and saw new footprints in the mud near the porch, boot prints. They weren't mine. They led around the side of the cabin and then down toward the graveyard. The drag marks were back too, fresh and darker this time. I followed them, keeping Duke close. The tracks stopped near the edge of the graveyard, right where the old iron fence was bent open. The ground there looked disturbed, like someone had been digging. There was a small pile of wet dirt and a half-buried shovel that hadn't been there before. My stomach tightened, It didn't look like a recent burial or anything official. It looked like someone had come in the night to dig something up, or try to. I decided I'd had enough. I packed my things that afternoon, loaded the truck, and left the cabin before dark. Duke sat in the passenger seat again, looking out the window as the cabin disappeared behind us. A few weeks later, I reported what I saw to the company. They told me the land was under dispute and that someone had been trespassing out there for months. A few locals said they'd seen a man wandering the woods near that area, living off whatever he could find. Nobody ever found him, but the shovel and the footprints matched the description of an old hermit who used to dig around abandoned graveyards looking for old valuables or relics. The company sent another team out to clear the land the next spring, and they told me later that the cabin had collapsed during the winter storms. The graveyard had been fenced off for safety. I never went back, and I never wanted to. Even now, when I think about those nights, it's not the sound of the dragging that sticks with me the most. It's the feeling that whoever or whatever was out there wasn't trying to scare me. It was just doing something it had done for a long time, something quiet, methodical, and unsettlingly human. It was the fall of 2018 when I decided to take a week off work and head out to a hunting cabin deep in the mountains of western Montana. I was 34 then, worn out from city noise and office lights. I'd been going hunting since I was a teenager, and that trip was meant to clear my head. A coworker of mine, an older guy who owned land out there, offered me the use of his family's old hunting cabin. He said it hadn't been used in a few years but was stocked with the basics: firewood, canned food, even a small generator. I didn't think much of it. I just wanted quiet, open air, and the kind of silence you can only get when you're miles away from anyone else. The drive took me about 8 hours. The last 2 were on rough, unpaved forest roads that barely looked like roads at all. The trees got thicker, the land steeper, and the cell service cut off long before I reached the place. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow path, just big enough for my truck to squeeze through. When I finally saw it, it looked like something straight out of an old photograph. A square wooden cabin with a rusted tin roof, a small porch with a single rocking chair, and a stack of logs by the side wall. There was a small clearing around it, but beyond that was nothing but dense pine forest stretching for miles. The air was crisp and cold, the kind that stings your nose when you breathe too deep. I unloaded my rifle, sleeping bag, and food supplies. Inside, the place smelled like old wood and dust. The floor creaked under my boots. There was a single main room with a cot, a small table, an oil lamp, and a wood stove. The back had a tiny storage room where I found old traps, rope, and an old deer mount with one antler missing. The windows were small and had thick curtains. I spent the first day settling in. I collected some firewood, cleaned up the place, checked the rifle, and walked around the area to get a feel for it. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I didn't even hear birds most of the time. When the sun began to drop behind the trees, that quiet turned into a heavy kind of silence. I could hear the wind move through the trees, and sometimes I thought I heard faint cracks of branches, but I told myself it was deer. That night, I cooked a can of beans on the stove and ate while sitting on the porch. The stars were clear, brighter than I'd seen in years. There was no sound except the crackling of the stove inside. It felt peaceful but also strangely tense, like something was watching from the tree line. I couldn't shake that feeling, even though I saw nothing but darkness. The next morning, I woke up early to start hunting. The air was freezing, and frost had formed on the porch railing. I walked a few miles west, following some tracks that looked like deer. They led into a thicket near a creek. I sat there for hours waiting. Nothing showed. Around noon, I packed up and started heading back. As I walked, I noticed something odd. There were footprints that weren't mine. They were faint, but they looked fresh, maybe from that morning. They weren't animal tracks either. They were boots, heavy ones, maybe work boots. I followed them for a while, thinking someone else might be hunting nearby, but they disappeared into the brush near the ridge. When I got back to the cabin, everything looked normal. Still, I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling. The door was closed, the firewood untouched, but when I stepped inside, I noticed something small but strange. My pack wasn't where I'd left it. I had put it near the table before leaving, but now it was near the cot. It wasn't a big deal, maybe I had moved it and forgotten, but it made me feel off. I checked inside it. Everything was still there, but the zipper was open halfway. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing small sounds outside the cabin, like someone stepping on leaves but not moving fast enough to be an animal. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark for a long time, listening. The sound would come and go, soft, almost cautious. It was too deliberate to be wind. Around 2 in the morning, I finally drifted off, gripping my rifle beside the cot. The next morning, I found something that really bothered me. About 20 yards from the porch, near the edge of the clearing, I found boot prints again. They led around the cabin, circling it. I hadn't noticed them the day before. I walked the perimeter slowly, and the pattern was clear. Someone had walked around the cabin at least twice. The ground was damp, so the prints were deep and fresh. Whoever it was had been there last night. I started feeling angry, thinking maybe some trespasser or poacher was messing around. I kept my rifle close that day, didn't wander far. I stacked wood, cleaned my gear, and stayed alert. By evening, I had convinced myself it was probably just some drifter or hunter passing through. I even locked the door from the inside before dark. That night was worse. I woke up around midnight to a sound I can't forget. It was slow, heavy breathing, close enough that I thought it was coming from just outside the window. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard it almost drowned out everything else. The breathing went on for several seconds, then stopped. Then I heard soft steps moving toward the porch. The old boards creaked under weight. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring into the dark, my rifle across my lap. The steps stopped at the door. I could see the faint shadow of movement through the thin curtain. It stood there for what felt like forever. I didn't even blink. After a while, the sound faded. I heard nothing else. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep from exhaustion because I woke up with daylight pouring in through the window. When I went outside, I saw fresh prints again, clearer this time. They led right up to the door. But this time I saw something worse. Behind the cabin, by the woodpile, there was a half-eaten deer carcass. It hadn't been there yesterday. The head was gone, the ribs torn open, meat stripped in a way that didn't look like a clean hunter's kill. There were boot prints around it, the same ones I'd seen before. Whoever it was had dragged that deer here during the night. I couldn't understand why. By that point, I'd had enough. I packed my things as fast as I could, but when I went to start my truck, it wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead. I checked under the hood, and that's when I saw the problem. The cables had been cut. Cleanly. I didn't have spares, and I was miles from any main road. My stomach sank. Someone had done that on purpose. I went back inside and locked the door again. I decided to wait until morning, then start walking down the road to find help. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every sound made me tense up. Around 1 a.m., I heard movement again, slow and steady, circling the cabin. Then it stopped. A few minutes later, something hit the side of the cabin, hard. Then another hit and another, like someone was throwing rocks. The noise echoed in the dark. I gripped my rifle, trying not to make a sound. After a while, it stopped. The woods went dead quiet again. When the first light came, I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my pack, filled my canteen, and started walking. I followed the dirt road for what felt like hours before I finally reached a ranger station by the base of the mountain. A ranger there gave me a ride to town. When I went back later with a tow truck to get my truck, we found the cabin's door wide open. Inside, everything had been trashed. My sleeping bag was torn, cans were scattered, and deep boot prints covered the floor. Out by the woodpile, that deer carcass was gone. Nothing left but a blood stain on the dirt. The sheriff said it was probably some local squatter or someone living off the grid. But whoever it was had cut my battery cables and stood outside my door in the middle of the night for 3 nights in a row. They didn't try to steal anything. They didn't speak. They just watched. I never went back there again. The cabin's owner later told me he sold the land the next year after someone broke into it again. They found new tracks around it and a dead raccoon nailed to the side of the porch. Nobody ever caught whoever did it. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night and it's quiet, I still think about those nights in that cabin. The sound of those slow steps, the breathing outside the window, the way the woods went silent before it all started. I keep wondering if that person was watching me even before I arrived. If they'd been living out there all along, waiting for someone to come back. And that thought still keeps me awake, long after I left those woods behind. It was early October of 2012 when I decided to take a short trip out into the countryside of northern Montana. I had been working construction for most of that summer, and after months of long days under the sun, I just needed to be alone for a while. I borrowed my uncle's old pickup truck and drove north until I reached an area called Bear Ridge. It wasn't much of a place, just miles of forest, rough dirt roads, and long stretches of open land where the trees looked almost black when the light started to fade. My plan was simple: spend 2 nights in the woods, do a bit of hiking, and come back home before the weekend. I packed light, some canned food, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a small gas stove. I didn't have a specific place to camp, but I remembered an old dirt path that curved off the main road and cut deep through the forest. My uncle told me once that there used to be hunting cabins scattered out there years ago, most of them falling apart now. I figured I might find one that could still offer a roof if it started raining. Around late afternoon, after driving through rough, uneven tracks for about half an hour, I spotted something through the trees. Wooden walls, a slanted roof, and a chimney half collapsed to one side. It looked like a cabin, standing crooked in a small clearing with tall grass almost reaching the windows. The place was old, probably abandoned for decades. One side of the porch had caved in, and the front steps were missing a few planks. The door hung slightly off one hinge, creaking with every small gust of wind. Still, I was tired and the sun was dropping fast, so I decided it was better than sleeping out in the open. Inside, the air was heavy and stale, like damp wood and dust. Cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling, and the floor creaked under every step. There was an old table pushed against one wall, a rusted stove in the corner, and a small bed frame without a mattress. A few old tools lay scattered on the floor: hammer, saw, and something that looked like an old lantern, though it was too rusted to work. I cleared a small space in the corner, spread out my sleeping bag, and lit my small gas stove to heat up a can of beans. The quietness outside felt strange. Even deep in the woods, you usually hear something: crickets, wind, or distant movement. But that evening it was dead silent. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on eating and setting up for the night. I left my flashlight beside me and turned it off to conserve the battery. The darkness came fast, thick and absolute. Lying there, I could barely see the outline of the window. I must have dozed off for an hour or so before a sound woke me. It was faint at first, something like the crunch of leaves outside. I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon, so I stayed still. But the sound came again, slower, more deliberate. It wasn't the erratic movement of an animal. It sounded like careful footsteps circling the cabin. My chest tightened, and I reached for my flashlight without making a noise. I clicked it on quickly and aimed it at the door. Nothing, just the same cracked wood and peeling paint. The footsteps stopped right after the light came on. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, listening. The silence returned. I told myself it was probably my mind exaggerating things. It's easy to start imagining sounds when you're alone in a place like that. I finally turned the flashlight off again, pulled my sleeping bag tighter, and tried to go back to sleep. But I couldn't shake that feeling. The quiet wasn't normal. Felt like something was just outside, watching, waiting. Around midnight, I heard it again, this time from the back of the cabin. It wasn't footsteps now. It was more like a scraping sound, something sliding or dragging along the wood outside. I sat up fast, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound moved along the wall slowly, like someone was running a hand or something sharp against it. I didn't move. My breathing felt too loud. After a few seconds, I forced myself to turn the flashlight back on and pointed it toward the window. The glass was dirty and streaked, but I thought I saw movement, just a faint shift of shadow against the tree line. Then it was gone. I waited, frozen, until the scraping stopped. After that, there was nothing again. I thought about grabbing my things and getting in the truck, but the path was rough and narrow, and I wasn't sure I could drive it safely in the dark. So I stayed, sitting upright for the rest of the night, barely blinking. By morning, the fear felt almost silly. In the daylight, the cabin looked less menacing, just an old structure breaking down with time. I stepped outside, checking around the walls, and sure enough, there were marks along the back, thin, uneven scratches running along the boards. They looked too low to be from a person and too irregular for an animal. Still, I told myself maybe it was a tree branch moving in the wind or something like that. I packed my things, ready to leave, but a mix of curiosity and stubbornness made me decide to stay one more night. The day passed quietly. I explored the woods a bit, found a small stream about half a mile away, and tried to relax. But even under the sun, I couldn't shake that uncomfortable sense that the forest felt empty. It was strange. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind through the trees. Just stillness. I kept telling myself it was fine. By evening, clouds rolled in, and it started to drizzle lightly. I went back to the cabin and set up my sleeping bag again, lighting the stove for warmth. When darkness fell, it was different than before. Heavier. The rain had stopped, but the air felt thicker somehow. I turned off my light early, wanting to force myself to sleep, but I couldn't. Every creak of the woods sounded louder, sharper. Then came the noise again, this time from under the cabin. I froze. The sound was faint but clear, a slow dragging, like something moving beneath the floorboards. I sat completely still, staring at the ground. The space under the cabin wasn't large, just enough to crawl through if someone wanted to hide there. I thought about that and felt a cold wave crawl up my spine. The dragging continued, stopping once, then starting again, moving closer to where I sat. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, shining it down at the floor. The boards were old and uneven, small gaps between them. Through one of those gaps, I saw something, movement like a shadow shifting slowly beneath. That was enough. I grabbed my pack, my flashlight, and bolted out the door. Outside, the air was damp and cold. I didn't look back. I ran to the truck, threw my stuff in, and started the engine. The tires spun in the mud before catching grip, and I drove as fast as I could down that narrow dirt road, branches scraping the sides of the truck. My heart didn't stop racing until I reached the main road again, miles away from that place. I didn't tell anyone much about it when I got back. I figured nobody would believe it anyway. A few weeks later, though, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up that area online, Bear Ridge, old hunting cabins, anything. I found a short article from years ago about a man who'd gone missing there in the late 90s. They said he'd been a drifter who sometimes stayed in the woods, using one of the old cabins as shelter. The article said his truck was later found abandoned not far from the main road. They searched but never found his body. I still think about that sometimes. The sounds, the scratches, and that movement under the floor. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but whatever was under that cabin that night was real. Maybe it was an animal, maybe someone hiding out there, or maybe even remains that had shifted as the structure rotted away. But I know what I felt. The fear was too real to be imagined. I've never gone camping alone again since then. Every time I drive past the woods or see an old cabin by the side of the road, my chest tightens a little, because I know what it's like to sit in the dark and feel something alive moving just inches away from you. Something you can't see, something that waits until the lights go out. I was 29 when I decided to spend a few weeks alone at my uncle's old farm cabin in northern Arkansas. He'd passed away 2 years before, and the place had just been sitting there, half forgotten. It wasn't even a proper house, just a one-room wooden cabin with a rusted tin roof, surrounded by fields that hadn't been plowed in decades. I wanted quiet, space, and maybe some time away from everything in the city that had started to feel too loud, too full. The drive up there took me through empty country roads that twisted through dead-looking trees and past barns that leaned like they were giving up. When I got to the cabin, I realized how run-down it really was. The wood on the walls had turned gray from the weather, the porch sagged slightly, and weeds pushed through every inch of dirt around it. There was a barn about 100 yards away, its doors barely hanging on their hinges. A dry well stood between the two buildings, covered with a warped wooden lid that looked ready to cave in. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and old hay. The floorboards creaked with every step. There was one small bed frame with a torn mattress, a metal table with 2 chairs, and a wood stove with a rusted pipe that went up through the ceiling. I cleaned for hours that first day, sweeping out layers of dirt and dead insects. When the sun began to drop behind the trees, the air grew colder, and I decided to light a fire in the stove. The smoke came out slow, as if reluctant to leave, but it eventually caught and warmed the cabin enough for me to sit and eat a can of beans I'd brought along. I remember thinking it felt peaceful, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears. No cars, no voices, just the sound of wind moving through dry grass and the occasional creak from the roof. That first night, I slept lightly. Every noise seemed magnified. The scratching of mice in the walls, the branches tapping against the window, the settling of the wood. At around 2 in the morning, I woke to a dull thud coming from outside. I lay still, waiting to hear it again. Came slow, heavy, like someone dropping something soft on the ground. Then silence. I told myself it was just something falling from a tree, maybe a branch. The place was surrounded by old oaks. It made sense. I forced myself to go back to sleep, even though it took hours. The next morning, when I stepped outside, I noticed tracks in the dirt near the porch. They weren't boot prints, more like deep impressions of bare feet. The ground was dry and packed, but whoever or whatever made them must have been heavy, because the marks were clear. The toes were wide, the steps uneven, like someone walking with a limp. They led around the cabin toward the barn. I followed them out of curiosity more than fear. The air smelled faintly like something rotting near the barn. When I got close, I saw the source. Behind the barn, half covered in straw, was a dead deer. His body was stiff but not torn apart. No blood, no sign of predators, just dead, lying there like it had fallen asleep and never moved again. The smell was strong, thick, and sour. I dragged the carcass farther out, figuring I'd bury it later. That night, the thuds came again, this time louder, closer. The sound wasn't random. It was deliberate, like footsteps circling the cabin. I could hear the crunch of dry leaves. My heart was pounding. I didn't move, just stared at the door, counting the seconds between each sound. Then everything went quiet again, and I sat there in the dark until morning light crept through the cracks in the window. By the third day, I was exhausted from not sleeping. I spent most of the afternoon fixing small things to distract myself. Patching a hole in the roof with an old sheet of tin, clearing weeds around the porch. That's when I noticed something strange near the edge of the field. A pile of stones stacked neatly, about knee-high. They hadn't been there before. There was no reason anyone would have made it. It was too far from the road, too deep into the property. The stones were arranged carefully, not just thrown together. I didn't touch it. I didn't even go close. I told myself maybe it had always been there and I just hadn't seen it before. That evening, I cooked some rice on the stove and sat near the small window that faced the field. The pile of stones was still there, faintly visible in the dim light. The sky turned dark fast, and the only light left was from my fire. I was reading an old magazine I'd found in a drawer when I heard it again, that same dragging step outside. It stopped right beneath the window. I didn't move. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I could hear breathing, slow, rough breathing, like someone catching their breath after walking a long way. Then the porch creaked. I picked up the old hunting rifle that had been hanging above the stove. It wasn't loaded. I hadn't found any bullets yet, but holding it made me feel like I had some control. The breathing moved toward the door. I waited, staring at the handle, every muscle in my body tight. Nothing happened. After a long minute, the sound moved away, slow and dragging again, until it faded completely. When daylight came, I went outside again. The ground around the porch was disturbed, fresh footprints in the dust. The same uneven, bare tracks. But there was something else this time. On the door frame, scratched into the wood, were faint lines. 4 of them like fingernail marks. I started packing that afternoon. I told myself I'd had enough of this place. I'd come here to clear my head, not lose my sanity. But before leaving, I wanted to at least check the barn one more time, make sure I hadn't left anything behind. Inside, the air was damp and stale. Dust floated in the sunlight coming through the gaps in the roof. I noticed the back door was open. It had been shut before. The hinges squeaked as it swung slightly with the wind. When I stepped closer, I froze. There were clothes hanging from one of the wooden beams. Filthy, torn clothes that looked like they'd been there for years. A pair of old jeans, a shirt with holes, and a jacket. Beneath them was an old metal bucket filled with something dark and dried. I didn't want to look closer, but I could tell it was blood, old, flaked, but definitely blood. That's when everything clicked. The deer, the tracks, the scratching. Someone had been living out here. Not a ghost, not some creature, a real person. Maybe some squatter or someone hiding, using this place for God knows how long. The pile of stones, the breathing outside, it all made sense in a terrifyingly real way. I didn't even look back at the cabin when I left. I got in my truck and drove down the dirt road so fast I almost slid off twice. My hands were shaking the whole time. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station 20 miles away. A week later, when I told a local sheriff what I'd seen, he sent a deputy to check. They found signs that someone had been camping in the barn. A sleeping bag, some old cans, a small knife. Whoever it was had disappeared. The deputy said it wasn't unusual out there. Sometimes people drift through those woods, staying on abandoned properties. That night, I thought about how close I'd been to whoever it was, how they'd stood outside while I slept, breathing just feet from me. I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. The sound of footsteps, the scratch marks, that heavy breathing. It wasn't something supernatural. It was worse, it was real. I never went back to that cabin again. It's probably still there, falling apart in the fields, with the well rotting away beside it. But sometimes, when I think about it late at night, I wonder if whoever was there ever left, or if they just moved deeper into those woods, waiting for someone else to come looking for quiet. It was late autumn of 2014 when I rented a small cabin in the Lake District of Northern England. I had taken a week off from my job in Manchester to get away from the noise of the city. My plan was simple: read, hike, and clear my head. I was 31 at the time, single, and tired of how routine my days had become. I found the cabin online through a local letting site, a one-bedroom wooden place near a small lake called Ennerdale Water. The photos showed it surrounded by thick trees and misty hills behind it. It looked quiet, peaceful, and far enough from anyone else that I could finally breathe for a while. The owner, a man named Arthur, left the key under a flat stone near the door. The place was old but clean. There was a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a single bed against the far wall. The floor creaked under my boots, and the windows had moisture trapped between the glass panes. Outside, the air smelled of wet earth and pine. It was colder than I expected for early November, the kind of cold that sits deep in your bones even before the real winter starts. The first night went fine. I made a simple meal, sat by the stove, and read until my eyes started to close. The forest outside was dead silent except for the occasional wind pushing through the trees. I fell asleep to the sound of that wind brushing against the wooden walls. The second night was when I noticed her. It was around 10:30. I had stepped outside to smoke, standing near the short wooden steps of the porch. The forest was darker than I had ever seen before, a black wall with only the faintest shapes of branches moving against the sky. I had a small lantern sitting on the step beside me, giving off a weak yellow glow. That's when I saw movement near the tree line, maybe 30 or 40 meters away. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a person. She was standing between two birch trees, not moving. I could see the faint outline of her. A woman, tall and thin, wearing something long like a coat or a dress that brushed against her boots. She wasn't walking, just standing there, facing the cabin. I remember how unnaturally still she was. Even when the wind picked up, her arms didn't move. I couldn't see her face clearly, only the pale color of her skin and a bit of her hair, which looked messy, sticking out like she'd been out there a while. I stared for a long time, trying to figure out if she was lost or needed help. I didn't hear a sound from her. No movement, just standing there. I called out, but the sound of my voice startled me, echoing against the trees in a way that didn't feel right. She didn't answer or move. After another minute, I went back inside and locked the door. I felt stupid for doing it, but something about her stillness made me uneasy. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing her shape standing there in the dark. When I finally drifted off, I woke up around 4 a.m. to the sound of something brushing against the outside wall. It was soft, like a hand dragging along the wood. I told myself it was the branches or the wind, but I knew there weren't any trees close enough to scrape the walls. In the morning, I went outside to check. The ground was damp and muddy from the rain, and I saw faint footprints near the porch steps. Thin, small prints, barefoot. They led away from the cabin toward the trees, the same direction I had seen her standing the night before. The next day was gray and quiet. I tried to focus on hiking, but I couldn't shake off the image of her. I walked a few miles around the lake, passing no one except a fisherman on the far side. When I got back in the late afternoon, it was already getting dark. The cabin looked smaller now, lonelier. I went inside, made some tea, and tried to read again, but I couldn't focus. Every small sound outside made me lift my head. Around 8 p.m., I heard footsteps on the porch, slow, careful ones. I froze. The book slid from my hands onto the floor. The sound stopped right outside the door. I waited, holding my breath. Then I heard a soft creak, like someone leaning against the railing. I didn't move. I didn't want to look out the window. After a minute, the sound stopped. I waited another 10 minutes before I finally forced myself to look. When I moved the curtain aside just a little, she was there again, standing at the edge of the clearing near the trees, closer this time. Her clothes looked darker, wet maybe, and her hair hung in front of her face. She was still staring right toward the cabin. I didn't sleep that night either. In the morning, I packed my things. I had 3 more nights booked, but I didn't care. The sun was low, and I wanted to be gone before evening. When I stepped outside, I saw new footprints, more of them circling around the cabin this time. They were bare, narrow, and uneven, as if she'd been walking slowly all night. I felt sick looking at them. As I loaded my bag into the car, I noticed something near the porch. A small pile of objects, laid out neatly. 3 stones, a piece of string, and a small glass button. I hadn't put them there. I kicked them aside and got in the car. My hands were shaking when I started the engine. The nearest town, Egremont, was about 30 minutes away. I stopped at a small cafe to calm down. I sat by the window, trying to convince myself that I'd overreacted, that maybe she was just a lost local or someone camping nearby. But the barefoot tracks didn't make sense. The weather had dropped to near freezing at night. Nobody would be walking around like that. On the drive back to Manchester, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that still figure standing among the birch trees. It felt like she had been watching me for days, moving closer each night. A few weeks later, I got curious and looked up the area again. I found an old local newspaper article from 2007 about a missing woman named Grace Harlow who disappeared while hiking near Ennerdale Water. The article said she was last seen near the same area where the cabins were built. They never found her body. I remember staring at the photo in the article. Her long face, sharp nose, and messy dark hair. It looked disturbingly like the woman I'd seen. I didn't tell anyone about it. There was no point. Maybe my mind had filled in the blanks. Maybe it was some homeless person living out there. Maybe it was all just the product of my own exhaustion. But I know what I saw. Even now, years later, I can still picture her standing in that dim light, half hidden by the trees, unmoving and silent. Sometimes I still dream of that cabin. The smell of damp wood, the sound of the floor creaking, the fog curling through the trees, and always just beyond the edge of the clearing. She's there. I haven't gone back to the Lake District since. I sold the camping gear, deleted the photos, and stopped renting anything remotely isolated. But every time I drive through the countryside and see a line of trees at dusk, I find myself scanning the shadows, expecting to see that still figure again, standing there watching, as if waiting for me to come back. It was late October of 2014, the kind of cold that made your fingers ache even when you were just holding a cup of coffee. I had taken a week off work to get out of the city and spend some time alone in the woods of northern Maine. I'd rented a small hunting cabin about 40 miles from the nearest town, a quiet spot off an old logging road that barely anyone used anymore. The guy who rented it to me, someone I'd found online, said it had heat, running water, and a wood stove. That's all I needed. I wanted quiet. No emails, no people, no traffic. Just quiet. When I got there, it was late afternoon. The cabin was smaller than I expected. 1 room, a small kitchen area, a single bed, and a metal stove in the corner. It smelled like pine and dust, like no one had stayed there in months. I unpacked my things. A sleeping bag, a couple cans of food, a flashlight, and my old hunting rifle. I wasn't much of a hunter anymore, but I liked carrying it when I went hiking in isolated areas. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the stove, writing a few notes in my journal, listening to the wind brush against the windows. The only sound came from the fire crackling in the stove and the trees outside creaking in the cold. I slept hard that night, probably the best sleep I'd had in months. The next morning, I took a long walk down the logging road. The air smelled clean, crisp, and earthy. The trees had already lost most of their leaves, and the ground was covered in a thick, soft layer of brown and orange. I didn't see another soul, not a car, not even a plane overhead. That isolation felt strange at first, but kind of freeing. Around midday, I came across an old, rusted pickup parked maybe half a mile off the main path. The thing looked like it hadn't moved in years. The windows were fogged, one of them cracked. I peered inside and saw a mess of old beer cans, a torn jacket, and what looked like a sleeping bag balled up on the seat. I figured it was just some local hunter's junk that got left there. That night, things started feeling off. It began with noises outside, slow, heavy footsteps on the leaves. I heard them around 10 or 11 at night, just when I was about to turn in. I thought it might be a deer, so I ignored it. But then I realized it wasn't the kind of sound a deer made. It was heavier, more deliberate, like someone stepping carefully, 1 foot at a time. I got up and turned off the stove so I could hear better. Everything went dead quiet. Then, faintly, I heard something brush against the cabin wall. Just one slow drag, like a sleeve or a bag rubbing on the wood. I stood there in the dark for a while, my heart pounding, waiting for another sound. Nothing came. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just an animal. I went to bed but barely slept. The next morning, I went outside and checked around the cabin. The ground was damp from light rain overnight, and I noticed footprints in the mud near the back wall. They weren't boot prints, not exactly, but close, barefoot maybe, though too big for that to make sense. The heel marks were clear, and they went off into the trees. I felt uneasy all day. I tried to distract myself by chopping firewood, cleaning up the cabin, walking around the area, but the thought of those footprints kept circling in my head. By evening, the wind had picked up, and the temperature dropped fast. The trees groaned against each other in the wind, and every sound made me jump. That night, I barely ate. I kept the lights low and stayed near the stove. Around midnight, I heard it again, this time from the front side of the cabin. Slow steps on the porch, then a faint knock, not even loud, just 3 soft taps on the door. I froze. Whoever it was didn't say anything. They didn't try the handle. Just those 3 knocks and silence after. I sat there holding my rifle, listening. After about 5 minutes, I heard the footsteps move away, leaves crunching softly, then nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. When morning came, I checked the porch. There were wet marks like muddy footprints, and they stopped right in front of the door. Same pattern as before, barefoot but large, almost too long. I looked out toward the woods, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't before. About 50 yards from the cabin, between the trees, was an old makeshift camp. A tarp stretched between 2 branches, a fire pit full of ashes, and some trash scattered around. Empty cans, a half-burned log. I walked closer, slowly. The fire had gone cold, but it hadn't been out for long. There was still warmth under the ash when I touched it. Whoever had been staying there had been there recently, maybe last night. I found a few other things too. A torn backpack, a knife stuck into a log, and a few crumpled papers. One looked like an old road map with red circles drawn on it. The circles were around small roads and cabins in the area. My stomach dropped when I saw one of the circles. My cabin. Someone had marked it. I walked back to the cabin fast, locked the door, and shut the curtains. I stayed inside for hours trying to think of what to do. There was no phone signal that far out, and the nearest town was at least an hour's drive on rough dirt roads. I told myself I'd leave at first light the next morning. That night was the worst. The wind had died down completely, and the silence made every small noise sound loud. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something outside again. This time not just footsteps, but the sound of someone trying the door handle. Slowly, metal clicking. Then the faint creak of wood on the porch boards. like weight shifting back and forth. I sat there in the dark, clutching the rifle. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The handle rattled again, a bit harder. Then silence. After a minute, I heard footsteps walking away around the side of the cabin. Then a scraping sound near the window, like something dragged along the glass. I waited until the first light of dawn before moving. My heart was still pounding as I packed everything I had into my bag. I didn't even eat or make coffee. I just wanted to get out. When I opened the front door, I saw something that made my stomach twist. On the porch, written in mud or maybe something darker, were the words, "I see you." The footprints led away into the woods again. I didn't stop to think. I threw my stuff into the truck and started the engine. The road was rough and narrow, but I didn't care. I drove as fast as I could until I reached the paved road about 20 miles away. I didn't even look back. Later, when I told the county police about what happened, they said a man had been living in the woods for months. A homeless drifter, possibly violent. They'd found signs of camps all over that area, mostly near unoccupied cabins and hunting sites. No one ever caught him. They said he probably moved on once he realized someone had seen his camp. I never went back to that cabin. I couldn't even bring myself to look at pictures of it when the rental site sent me follow-up messages months later. That week in the woods cured me of ever wanting peace and quiet again. Now, when I think about that night, the slow knocks, the footprints, the writing on the porch, I realize how close I probably came to opening the door. How close someone might have been standing there, watching me through the dark, waiting for a chance. It wasn't ghosts or anything out of a movie. It was just a man. And somehow that makes it so much worse. I was 28 when I decided to take a week off from work and head out to a cabin in the woods near Millers Creek, Oregon. I'd been working long hours at a construction company and hadn't had a real break in almost 2 years. A coworker told me about this old cabin he used once during hunting season. Small, cheap to rent, quiet, no tourists, no noise, just trees and a narrow dirt road leading to it. That sounded perfect to me. I drove up there on a cold Tuesday morning in late October 2014. The weather had already started to turn gray, and the air felt heavier than it did in the city. I left Portland around 9 a.m. and reached the area by early afternoon. Once I passed the small town, the paved road turned into gravel, and from there it turned to dirt. The trees got denser, darker. The GPS signal flickered out, but I had printed directions. They led me through a narrow path that twisted through miles of pine forest. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked smaller than I expected. The wood siding had dark stains from rain and years of neglect. One window had a crack through it, and the roof looked slightly uneven. There was an old wooden shed about 30 feet away, half collapsed on one side. A rusted water pump sat out front beside a chopped log that must have been used as a stool years ago. The place looked quiet, too quiet, but I had come for peace and isolation, so I didn't let that bother me. Inside, the cabin had one main room with a small kitchenette, a narrow bed, and a wooden table. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something like metal, maybe the pipes. There was no electricity, only a gas lantern and a small stove. The first few hours were peaceful. I unpacked my things, walked around the property, and tried to get used to the silence. By sunset, I realized how quiet it really was out there. No cars, no voices, not even birds after dark. Just the sound of the wind scraping through the trees. The first night went by fine, though I had trouble sleeping. Every small sound stood out. The cracking of the wood in the walls, the wind moving through the chimney, the creak of the roof when it cooled. I tried to convince myself it was normal in an old place like that. The second day, I explored deeper into the woods behind the cabin. The ground was covered in pine needles, and every few steps I'd find broken glass bottles, rusted cans, and tire marks that looked decades old. At one point, I found an old pickup truck with its hood gone and vines growing through the windows. The tires were flattened and half buried in the soil. I remember thinking it must have been left there by some hunter years ago. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. It was strange. I could hear my heartbeat at times. That night, things started to feel different. Around 11 p.m., I woke up to a faint metallic sound, like a hinge squeaking, came from outside. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it again. A slow creak, followed by a dull thump. My first thought was that it was the shed door swinging in the wind. The next morning, I checked. The shed door was indeed open, but it was hanging unevenly and didn't look like it could swing freely. Took effort to move it, actually. That unsettled me a little. Later that day, I noticed footprints in the dirt behind the cabin. They weren't mine. I could tell because they were larger and deeper, and they went around the cabin toward the trees. They looked like boot prints. The dirt was dry enough that the prints must have been made not long before. I stood there for a while just staring at them, thinking maybe a hunter had passed through. But the cabin was on private property, and I hadn't heard any vehicles. That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked out the window, it felt like something had just moved out of sight. I cooked some beans on the stove, ate quickly, and locked the door from inside. The lock wasn't great, just a simple latch that didn't look like it could hold against much. I pushed the table against the door just in case. When I tried to sleep, I couldn't. My ears picked up every faint sound outside. A branch breaking, leaves shifting. At one point, around 2 a.m., I heard what sounded like footsteps on gravel. Not running, just slow, measured steps near the front. Then silence. My chest tightened. I didn't move, just stared at the ceiling. After about a minute, I heard it again, one step, then another. Then something scraped softly against the wall outside. Stopped after a while, but I didn't sleep again that night. By morning, I was exhausted. I went outside once the sun came up, and the first thing I noticed was that the footprints were back, newer ones this time. They led from the tree line straight toward the side of the cabin, stopped near the wall by my bed, then went back toward the woods. I looked closely. The prints overlapped slightly with the old ones, like whoever it was had come back. I decided I'd had enough. I started packing my things, planning to leave that afternoon. Around noon, though, my truck wouldn't start. The key turned, the lights flickered, but the engine wouldn't even try to turn over. I opened the hood and saw that the battery cables had been loosened. Not ripped off, but unscrewed and left hanging. My stomach sank. That wasn't an accident. I spent hours trying to fix it, tightening the cables with the small wrench I kept in the glove box. It started again just before sunset. I was ready to go, but a part of me didn't want to drive through those dark forest roads at night, not with how narrow and twisted they were. So I decided to leave early the next morning instead. That night was the worst one. I kept the lantern on and my boots by the bed. Around 1 a.m., I heard something tap lightly on the window. Just one tap at first, then two more slower. I froze. The window was small, near the table I'd pushed aside earlier. I stared at it for what felt like forever, but the light from the lantern didn't reach far enough to see outside. After a few minutes, I heard soft footsteps again, circling the cabin. They were slow, careful, then silence. At some point later, maybe around 3 a.m., I must have dozed off. I woke up when I heard the sound of the shed door slamming shut outside. That was it. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the handle of a hammer I found by the stove. When morning finally came, I packed everything in a rush, threw it in the truck, and left. I didn't even look back at the cabin. About 2 miles down the dirt road, I passed a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. There was an old campsite there, burnt logs, an overturned chair, some empty cans, and a torn sleeping bag half buried in the mud. It looked abandoned for months, maybe years. But what caught my attention was a piece of rope tied around a tree trunk with a metal hook on the end, hanging loose. It looked like something someone might have used to hang meat or something else. I didn't stop to look closer. I just kept driving until I reached the main road. When I got back home, I told myself it was probably some squatter or hunter messing around. Maybe someone who didn't like people near that area. But the more I thought about the footprints, the battery cables, and the tapping on the window, the less sense it made. 2 weeks later, I looked up Miller's Creek on Google out of curiosity. I found a local forum post from a few years back where someone mentioned people going missing near those woods. They said the property had been used by an illegal hunting group years ago, one that supposedly got shut down after police found remains of animals and possibly a person near one of the old cabins. The post didn't name which one. I still think about that sometimes, about how close I might have been to running into whoever was still out there walking around that night. I never went back to any cabin after that. It was late October of 2011, somewhere deep in the northern forests of Montana, where the tree lines ran for miles without a break. I had been working as a park ranger for just over 3 years, stationed at a remote ranger's cabin near Glacier Ridge. The cabin sat about 6 miles off the main road, tucked between tall pines and a narrow creek that ran behind it. It wasn't big, just one room with a wood stove, a metal cot, a small table, and a shortwave radio that barely worked when the weather turned bad. Most days were quiet, just maintenance checks and trail monitoring. But that fall, something about the forest felt off. The weather had been colder than usual, and animals had started behaving strangely. A few hikers had reported hearing strange sounds near the ridge. Low grunts, branches breaking, something moving at night that didn't sound like a bear. First, I brushed it off. You get all kinds of stories from people who aren't used to the woods. But when I started finding signs myself, broken branches high off the ground, claw marks on trees, deep tracks in the mud, I began to pay more attention. One Friday evening, I was finishing up some paperwork when the rain started. Came down hard, the kind of steady, cold rain that soaked through your clothes in minutes. I had planned to check a section of the trail earlier that day, but got delayed when a hiker twisted his ankle near the base camp. By the time I was free, it was getting dark. Still, I decided to head out, just a short patrol before the storm got worse. I grabbed my flashlight, my jacket, and the radio, which I clipped to my belt. The trail was slick, covered in wet leaves and mud. My boots made soft sucking sounds with every step. The air smelled like pine and wet earth. I could hear the creek rushing harder than usual behind the cabin, swollen from the rain. The deeper I went into the trees, the quieter it got. The sound of rain hitting the canopy faded to a dull hum, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch. I followed the path until I reached the old fire watch post, a wooden tower that hadn't been used in years. The ladder was half rotted, and the structure leaned slightly to one side. I always checked it anyway. Kids sometimes snuck up there during the summer. That night, the ground near it looked disturbed. The mud was churned up, and there were deep indentations near the base, like something heavy had been moving around. When I crouched to take a closer look, I noticed drag marks, 2 of them, leading off toward the trees. It didn't look like animal prints. It looked like something had been pulled. My stomach tightened. I followed them for maybe 10 yards before they disappeared into thicker brush. The rain had started coming down harder again, washing away details, so I turned back toward the cabin. My clothes were soaked, my flashlight beam cutting through the mist in short bursts. Back inside, I hung my jacket near the stove and sat down at the table. The radio was silent. I tried to reach the station but only got static. The power had gone out earlier that week, so all I had for light was the lantern. I poured myself a cup of stale coffee and tried to shake off the unease, but my mind kept circling back to those drag marks. Around midnight, I was sitting on my cot, jotting notes in the logbook, when I heard it. A thud, faint but heavy, came from outside, maybe near the woodpile. I froze, listening. Then came another, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight and walked to the window. The glass was fogged, but when I wiped it clear, I could see faint movement by the tree line. Something big. I switched off the lantern so the cabin went dark and watched. Whatever it was, it moved slowly, just at the edge of the light from the lantern's faint glow. My first thought was a bear, but bears didn't usually move like that. This thing was walking upright. I tried to convince myself it was a person, maybe another ranger or a hunter caught in the storm. But no one was supposed to be out here. I stayed still, watching until the shape finally disappeared into the dark. I didn't sleep that night. Every few minutes I thought I heard something outside. Branches snapping, soft footsteps in the mud. A faint scraping sound near the wall. I checked the door twice, making sure it was latched. The wind picked up, making the trees groan and sway. Around 3 a.m., there was another sound. Something brushing against the side of the cabin, slow and deliberate, like a hand dragging along the wood. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. After a few minutes, it stopped. The silence after was worse than the noise. I sat there, staring at the door, waiting for it to move, but it never did. When morning finally came, the rain had stopped. Everything outside was soaked, glistening in the pale light. I stepped out slowly, scanning the tree line. The ground around the cabin was covered in footprints, large ones. They weren't boot prints. They were barefoot and deep, as if whatever made them weighed a lot. I followed them to where the forest began, but they disappeared in the mud. That day, I hiked out to the nearest ranger outpost, about 4 miles away. The guy on duty, Mark, looked surprised to see me. I told him about the noise, the marks, the footprints. He didn't say much, just wrote it down and said he'd send a team to check it out. They never found anything, just the same drag marks I'd seen before and a few more prints that led nowhere. Over the next week, I stayed mostly inside after dark. The sounds kept coming, soft at first, then louder. Some nights I'd hear something circling the cabin, always just out of sight. I started keeping my rifle loaded, though I never had to use it. The worst part was the feeling of being watched. Even during the day, I'd catch movement in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing. By the 3rd week, I'd had enough. I radioed in and requested a transfer to a post closer to the main station. They approved it right away. I packed my things, cleaned the cabin, and left just after sunrise. The forest was quiet that morning, calm in a way that made me uneasy. The trail behind me was soft with mud, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following. When I reached the outpost, Mark asked if I wanted to log one last note for the cabin file. I hesitated, then wrote simply, *, unexplained activity around the cabin, possible trespasser, advise caution. *. A few months later, I heard the cabin was closed down. Too remote, they said. Too many reports of strange activity, damaged equipment, missing supplies. The official story was that it was just bears, maybe vandals. But I knew what I saw, and it wasn't either of those. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. The way the rain hit the roof, the sound of something dragging across the wall, those deep, barefoot prints in the mud. I've worked in plenty of remote areas since then, but I've never felt that same quiet dread again. Whatever was out there that night, it wasn't trying to attack me. It was just moving through, curious maybe, testing the boundaries of my little patch of light in the middle of all that dark forest. But sometimes, when I'm alone on patrol and the wind dies down, I still catch that sound. the faint scrape of something brushing past wood, and for a moment, I'm right back in that cabin again, waiting in the dark, listening to the forest breathe around me. It was late October of 1998 when I decided to spend a few days at my grandmother's old cabin in northern Wisconsin. I hadn't been there in years, not since I was a teenager. The place had been sitting empty ever since she passed away almost a decade ago, and nobody in the family ever bothered to go back. It was a small, weather-beaten structure tucked deep in the woods, about 5 miles from the nearest paved road. I only went there because I needed to get away from everything for a bit. My job had been eating at me, my relationship was falling apart, and I just wanted to be alone somewhere quiet. I thought the cabin would be peaceful, maybe even comforting in a strange, nostalgic way. When I first arrived, it didn't feel that way at all. The air was damp and cold, heavy with that thick smell of rotting wood and wet leaves. The road leading up to the property was barely visible through overgrown grass and fallen branches. My car's tires struggled to push through the mud, and by the time I reached the cabin, I was sweating even though the temperature couldn't have been more than 50 degrees. The cabin looked worse than I expected. The paint had completely peeled off the walls, the porch sagged inward on one side, and a few of the windows had cracks spidering across the glass. The roof had moss growing along the shingles, and the front steps felt soft under my boots, almost like they'd give way if I put too much weight on them. I stood there for a while, just staring at it, feeling this odd mixture of familiarity and discomfort. Inside, the air was stale. Dust floated in thick layers through the sunlight that broke in from small gaps in the curtains. The furniture was still where my grandmother had left it. Her wooden rocking chair by the fireplace, the tiny kitchen table with 2 chairs, and the couch with that same faded plaid cover she'd used since the 70s. I set my bag down and opened a few windows to let the air move a bit, though most of them barely budged from years of sticking shut. I spent the first hour sweeping out dead leaves, wiping off the counter, and clearing cobwebs. Every movement stirred up more dust, and I kept sneezing until my throat hurt. The cabin had a small back room that used to be her bedroom. I went in there next, planning to clean it out before setting up my sleeping bag. The door creaked loudly as I opened it. The smell hit me first, sharp and sour, like mold mixed with something metallic. The kind of smell that makes you instinctively breathe through your mouth. I figured maybe a raccoon or some animal had died under the floorboards. The room was dim, only lit by a single narrow window covered in grime. The bed was still made, the quilt folded neatly across it. There was an old wardrobe against the far wall, its doors slightly open. I hesitated before walking closer. Something about that smell bothered me more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just the stink of rot. It was thicker, heavier. I crouched down and looked around under the bed. Nothing there except dust and a few dead bugs. But when I got closer to the wardrobe, the smell got stronger. When I opened the left door, a wave of that foul air hit me so hard I had to step back. Inside, there were a few old dresses still hanging, yellowed with age. But on the floor, behind a stack of blankets, something dark and solid filled the space. I thought it was just a pile of old rags until I looked closer. It wasn't rags. It was a body. It took my brain a few seconds to actually process what I was seeing. The skin, what was left of it, was stretched tight over bones. The clothes looked old, the kind my grandmother used to wear, though they were stiff and discolored. I stumbled back and nearly fell over. My hands were shaking. I could feel my heart beating fast enough to hurt. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring. It didn't look recent, far from it. The smell, the state of it, everything told me it had been there for years. My stomach turned as I realized the body was probably my grandmother's. She'd been found dead years ago, or at least that's what I thought. My father had told me she'd passed away in a hospital after falling ill. We even had a funeral, but I hadn't seen the body myself. I'd just gone to the service, watched them lower a casket into the ground. I forced myself to back out of the room. I needed air. I stumbled outside and sat on the porch steps, breathing hard, trying to steady myself. I could still smell it on my clothes, that heavy, sickening odor that seemed to cling to everything. I tried to think rationally. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe someone else had broken in years ago and died there. But that didn't make sense either. Nobody came this far out. There were no tracks, no signs of forced entry. The door had been locked when I arrived. When the sun started to set, I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. I stayed on the porch, wrapped in my jacket, watching the woods grow darker. Every sound made me flinch. A snapping twig, a rustle in the leaves. I thought about leaving, but my car was parked halfway down the trail, and I didn't want to walk through the woods in the dark. I kept trying to convince myself I'd go in at dawn, call the sheriff, and get the hell out. That night was long. I tried to sleep in my car, but couldn't stop thinking about that room. Around midnight, I heard a noise from inside the cabin, faint but clear. It was the sound of something falling, maybe a chair tipping over. I froze. I didn't move for what felt like an hour, just gripping the steering wheel and staring at the cabin through the windshield. There was no light inside, just that black window staring back at me. In the morning, I forced myself to go back in. The smell was still there, stronger now since I'd left the door to the bedroom slightly open. I checked the wardrobe again, though I already knew what I'd find. The body hadn't moved, of course, but I noticed something I hadn't before. An old tin box sitting beside it. I reached in with my sleeve pulled over my hand and dragged it out. Inside were a few yellowed papers, some cash, and an old photograph of a man I didn't recognize. The papers were letters from my grandmother to someone named R. They were dated from the 1960s. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. One line caught my eye, asterisk, if they find out what happened, I'll never see daylight again. Asterisk, I didn't know what that meant, but it made my stomach twist. I folded the letters and shoved them back inside the box. I didn't want to know more. I left the cabin that day and drove straight to the sheriff's office in town. When I told them what I found, they sent a team up there immediately. I waited in the parking lot for hours, watching through the windshield as they came and went. Eventually, one of the deputies came out and told me what they'd found. An old human body, most likely female, dead for at least 15 years. They couldn't say for sure yet, but the clothing and belongings matched my grandmother's records. The deputy said something else too, something that stayed in my head since that day. He said the casket buried under her name had been empty when they checked. Turns out, she never died in any hospital. My father had signed the paperwork back then, but they said the medical records didn't exist. The cabin, the land, everything had just been left to rot. Nobody ever asked questions. I sold the property 2 months later. I never went back, not once. But sometimes, late at night, I catch that same smell in my nose. Faint but familiar, like the air inside that room. And I think about how long she must have been lying there, alone in that cold wooden box of a cabin, while the rest of us went on living like nothing ever happened. And even though I got my answers, it didn't bring me any peace. It just left me wondering who buried her there in the first place, and why no one in my family ever told the truth. It was late October 2013 when I drove up north into the mountains of Montana. I had taken a week off work, thinking the quiet would help clear my head. I was 36 then, tired of everything that came with city life, the noise, the people, the constant pressure. I just wanted to be alone for a while, away from anyone who could bother me. A friend of a friend had told me about a small, old hunting cabin near a lake, about 2 miles off the main dirt road. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was cheap and that was all I needed. The drive took most of the day. I left before sunrise, and by the time I got to the dirt road, the sun was already sinking behind the hills. The last part of the road was rough, full of ruts and stones. The truck bounced and rattled as I crawled along, the trees closing in on both sides, tall and dark like a tunnel. I could see the lake between the branches, still and gray, the water catching the last bit of light. The cabin was set a little back from the lake, maybe 50 yards into the trees. It looked small, one story, with a metal roof that had rust spots all over. There was a narrow porch out front and an old wooden chair that looked ready to collapse if anyone sat on it. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke and dust. There was one main room with a small kitchen area, a table, a single bed in the corner, and a wood stove. The walls were dark with age, and everything creaked when I walked. I could tell no one had stayed there for a long time. Still, it had what I needed: a place to sleep, a roof, and quiet. I unpacked my things slowly. I brought some food, a sleeping bag, a small radio, a flashlight, and a few tools. There was no phone service, which didn't surprise me. I wasn't planning to call anyone anyway. The first night went quietly. The woods outside were dead silent except for the occasional crack of a branch. The temperature dropped fast after sunset, and I could see my breath inside the cabin until the stove got going. I fell asleep early and woke up a few times to the sound of wind moving through the trees. Nothing strange, just the normal sounds of being out there alone. The next morning, I went down to the lake with a thermos of coffee. The air was cold and still, and a layer of mist hung over the water. I noticed how there were no birds around, not even the sound of insects. It felt empty in a way that was hard to describe. The silence almost felt heavier than noise. I tried not to overthink it. Later that day, I hiked a bit up the hill behind the cabin to look around. There was an old logging trail that hadn't been used in years. Fallen branches and brush covered most of it. A few 100 feet in, I found an old, rusted piece of equipment, maybe part of a saw or winch, left to rot under the trees. It made sense. The cabin was probably built by loggers decades ago. That night, I started hearing things. It began with a sound like light footsteps outside, crunching over leaves. At first, I thought it was a deer or raccoon. The sound came and went for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped completely. I waited a while before opening the door and stepping out with my flashlight. The air was freezing. My breath hung white in the beam of the light. I swept it around the clearing, the trees, the ground, nothing. I stood there for a while, just listening. The woods were completely still. I went back inside and tried to ignore it. By the third night, I noticed something odd. In the morning, I found new footprints near the edge of the clearing. Not animal tracks, boot prints. They came from the tree line, circled part of the cabin, then went back into the woods. The ground was damp from rain, so they were clear. The prints weren't mine, the tread was different, and they were smaller. That changed the feeling of everything. I kept checking the tree line all day after that. I couldn't stop thinking about who would even be out here. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and I hadn't seen another vehicle since leaving the main road. I convinced myself maybe a hiker had passed through and got curious. Still, it didn't sit right. That night, I made sure the door was locked and pushed a chair under the handle. The sound came again, those same light steps moving slow around the cabin. I didn't move. I sat on the bed, staring at the door. The sound went around the back, then faded. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, I checked again. More prints, fresh. Whoever it was had walked behind the cabin this time and stood near the window for a while. I could see where the ground was pressed down. I started to feel a different kind of fear. It wasn't about being alone anymore. It was knowing someone else was there, watching, waiting. The next day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't wander off or go to the lake. I gathered wood and kept the fire going inside even though it wasn't that cold. It made me feel less exposed somehow. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to stop. Every sound made me jump. Branches cracking, pine cones falling, the shifting of the cabin walls. When it got dark, I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark with my back to the wall, listening. The footsteps came again, closer this time, slower. I could hear them in the leaves, soft but steady, circling again. Then they stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I waited, holding the flashlight, afraid to turn it on. After what felt like an hour, I finally stood and looked out the window. There was nothing there, just the dim outline of trees. But I could feel it, like something was out there staring back. By dawn, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to pack up and leave. The plan was to drive straight back to town, no matter how bad the road was. But when I got outside, I saw something that made my stomach twist. The truck's back window had been shattered. Not completely, but cracked across the middle like someone hit it with a small rock or a tool. And the driver's side door was slightly open. I had locked it the night before. Inside, everything looked untouched, except for the glove box, which was open and empty. I didn't keep anything valuable in there, but that wasn't the point. Someone had been inside my truck. I threw my gear in the back and got in. The whole way down the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror. Every turn of the tires sounded too loud. The forest felt different in daylight. Not peaceful anymore, just heavy, suffocating. When I reached the paved road, I finally let myself breathe. I didn't stop until I got back into town. I parked outside a gas station, sat there for a few minutes, and just looked at my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I told the sheriff what happened, just the basics. He said sometimes drifters or squatters camp out in those woods. Sometimes they watch the cabins, wait until people leave, then go through their stuff. He said I was lucky nothing worse happened. Maybe he was right, but even now, years later, I still think about that cabin. I think about the sound of those slow steps in the leaves, circling in the dark, and the way the prints stopped right below the window. Whoever was out there wasn't just curious, they were waiting for something, watching. Maybe they thought I'd stay longer. Maybe they were waiting for me to open the door. I never went back to that cabin, and I never stayed alone in the woods again. Still, some nights, when everything is quiet, I swear I can hear that same slow crunch of footsteps in my head. Steady, careful, like someone still circling, waiting for me to fall asleep again.